Thank you very much indeed, Owen. We're going to move swiftly now to our keynote session, and we're very fortunate to have Dame Sarah Thornton as our keynote speaker this year. She needs no introduction, not just because she's been on the panel for the last half an hour in front of you all, but also because, as you all know, she's made a really sustained contribution to this area over very many years and in very many different capacities as well. From her time as Chief Constable of Thames Valley through to her time as Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, and now in her very policy-engaged research work at Nottingham's Rights Lab. So we're very, very fortunate to have Dame Sarah speaking to us today. And Julie Etchingham will be then in conversation with Sarah after Sarah has given her keynote. Julie is, as you all know, a very distinguished broadcast journalist, very experienced as well, with a very strong interest in modern slavery and human rights, and in many of the issues which I talked about in my introductory remarks about communications about modern slavery and human rights. And I've had many interesting conversations with Julie about these dilemmas of how to talk about such difficult subjects in a time when our information environment is as difficult as it currently is. So we're very fortunate to have Julie. Julie, if you'd like to come and join Sarah on the stage. And Sarah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for that kind introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. In the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, there comes a point when we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream to see where they are falling in. Prevention is so important, but often responding to the harms takes up all our energy and resources. Ella talked in that earlier panel about prevention being the neglected of the 3 Ps. It's so important, but often neglected. My colleague Liz Such reviewed, I think it was 37 MS-PEC research projects looking for the focus on prevention. And she found that only a couple was prevention actually foregrounded, that it was part of the research in a very explicit way. I mean, she said that virtually all the research projects in the portfolio had a prevention implication, but it was rarely explicit. So I think prevention is so key. We had a bit of a crash course in the public health model in that earlier session as well from Ella. I was doing some work last week on child criminal exploitation, where we know a part of prevention, early intervention, is so important. And what I was shocked to read is over about the last 10 years, the expenditure by local authorities in England on early prevention and early intervention has reduced by about 42%. Massive reductions. And that's because they're having to spend so much of their budgets on late interventions when the harm has already been done. But to go back to the theme of today, which is about labour exploitation, what about the prevention of labour exploitation? How can we prevent exploitation, which results from the sorts of aggressive commercial practices Namada was talking about, corporate negligence, lapses in governance, when they intersect with fragile communities, migrant labour, corruption and criminality? How can we think about prevention? How can we move beyond responding to the harm and think about preventing the harm? My last 4 years really have been very much focused on business and human rights and taking that broader view rather than just a narrower focus on modern slavery. When the Fair Work Agency was established a couple of weeks ago, the Department of Business and Trade published a report to mark the launch of the agency. It's called Decent Work, a review of evidence for effective prevention and detection of labour exploitation. It's quite an academic paper, but it has some good material in it. And of course, it talks about the continuum of exploitation, which was also mentioned earlier on. Many of you will be familiar with it. So at one end, you've got decent work, and then you continue along the continuum of exploitation as different labour abuses come into play with increasing severity. It's important for employers and regulators to provide decent working conditions, which limits the progression of these abuses along the continuum, particularly whether it's compliance with health and safety legislation, payment of the national minimum wage, access to identification documents, and the rights to organise and collective bargaining. All of these things are linked on that continuum until we get to the most serious offences. When I think about the case of the people who were trafficked to a branch of McDonald's in Cambridge, which was in the press and on TV a few years ago, the organised crime group that placed those victims of trafficking in McDonald's were only able to exploit them and steal their wages because of very poor practices in those McDonald's franchises, that people were working excessive hours, that the recruitment processes were poor, and governance and supervision were weak. That was the environment in which the most egregious forms of trafficking were taking place. Now, some of you will be familiar with the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which sets out the state's responsibility to protect human rights, businesses' responsibility to respect human rights, and the importance of remedy. Now, of course, it's voluntary. It's soft law. It's not hard law. But in fact, the UK was an early supporter. My argument would be that the implementation of the UNGPs protects against labour exploitation. It protects against the most serious forms of exploitation. Murray mentioned that I work with the Rights Lab. We were commissioned about 18 months ago by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office to benchmark the UK's implementation of these guiding principles by both the state, by the UK state, but also UK businesses. This national baseline assessment will be published in the next few weeks. And I think just kind of in general, I'm not going to spoil the report completely, but overall the picture is mixed. There has been activity, but has there really been progress? Laws have been passed, but they're not comprehensive, and enforcement is weak. Some businesses have taken steps, some are leaders, but many have not. And remedy remains elusive for most rights holders, whether that's remedy from business or remedy from the state. It is elusive and hard to access. And the findings of this assessment very much corroborate the work I've been doing with CCLA Investment Management to benchmark the performance in tackling modern slavery in the largest of companies. When we do the scoring of the companies, there is a significant gap between the companies that are in Tier 1 that are scoring well and the companies in Tier 4 or 5. Now, overall, over the last 3 years, there has been a steady improvement. So in the first year we did it, there were 37 companies in the top 2 tiers. In the second year, there were 46 companies. And last year, there were 56 companies. So there's been a gradual improvement. I suspect that won't be the case when we publish the benchmark this year because we have adjusted it. We've raised the bar because the guidance on transparency in supply chains published last year has raised the bar. And what's interesting, and very interesting in the context of that previous discussion, is that one of the things that's in that is the requirement for companies, or the guidance that companies should be engaging with those with lived experience when they develop their policies. And I think from having looked at a lot of these disclosures over the last 3 years, I don't think there are many companies that are doing that. I think there are big questions to be asked about how that can be done responsibly. What I really hope is the best companies will engage with those with a lived experience to think about how can we do this? How can we meet this new requirement? So my work at CCLA involves encouraging companies to improve their performance. And in doing so, we'll always say that that's because it's the right thing to do. Now, that's easier for CCLA because we're an ethical investor. The C's stand for churches and charities. So that's kind of part of our the way we are, and our clients expect us to do it. But I think it's really important when we talk about business that modern slavery is a salient risk. Of course, it's important, it matters to people, but it's also a material risk to businesses. It's salient, as I say, because it harms people and communities. But it is a material risk to companies because companies that neglect it face increased risk, regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and ultimately the erosion of their share price. And I'm going to give the example of the recent Dyson case. Now, there's some of you who might be aware of it, maybe not a lot of you haven't, but hopefully this meets all needs. We all know about Dyson and their expensive hairdryers. Well, the women do. 24 workers from Nepal and Bangladesh alleged, among other things, that their passports had been retained, their movement restricted, they had paid recruitment fees, resulting in debt bondage. They also alleged excessive overtime, unsafe working conditions, and they were subject to punitive disciplinary practices, including assault. This is in one of several of Dyson's suppliers in Malaysia. So this isn't a supplier factory, but there's basically most of their work, something like 80% of their work was building product for Dyson. They took the case and some really important results from it. It's arguably the most significant supply chain modern slavery claim to be brought before the English court and resolved as it was by settlement about 6 weeks ago. And the reason why it's important is because what you've got is using tort in terms of kind of the duty of care that was owed by Dyson to the people in this supply factory for the first time, applying it to a supplier, not just a subsidiary. So the first thing to say is, although the abuses, the exploitation were in Malaysia, it was heard in an English court. And that whole thing about jurisdiction was really important, and it went to the Supreme Court, who said, yes, we're not going to interfere with the decision, it should be held in the English court. There was a judgment following a case management hearing in January, which the judge talked about. It's really important in these cases to have equality of arms between a company and very vulnerable poor workers. And so the court had said Dyson need to, as a part of what's called early disclosure, so straight away disclose lots of key documents, audit reports that were done, communications between Dyson and its suppliers, emails from their legal officers. And arguably, it was that really tough view on what the company had to disclose led the company to, in fact, settle with the workers and pay them compensation. It's a really important case. It shows that supply chains are a material risk to companies, so it matters in terms of their business. Secondly, the whole point about the early disclosure. What matters is not what companies say, it's what they do. That's what really matters. And thirdly, when the problems arise, companies will find it increasingly difficult to contain them. You can't hide what you know. The audits, the meetings, the correspondence may all be subject to forensic examination in the courts. So this is a really important case. But I would argue, despite this case, which I think creates a big change in terms of businesses, I've come to the view over the last 4 years that businesses' respect for human rights should not be voluntary, that legislation is required to mandate human rights due diligence. And I would argue it's right for people, but it's also right for organisations. I don't know whether Eleanor's still here, but I would pay tribute to the excellent leadership she's been providing in pushing for legislation on mandating human rights due diligence. We've also been working as investors with other investors to present this case to government. In December, as investors, we wrote to the Secretary of State for Business and Trade, making the point. Last month, we wrote to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. And we're gathering more investors. In December, we had 25 investors signing the letter. 34 supported the view that actually we do need to level the playing field and that we need to mandate human rights due diligence in the UK. And in fact, the last letter with, as I say, 34 investors, they own assets under management, they hold assets under management of £1.6 trillion. So this is quite a lot of big investors saying this is what we want. And one of the things we did, we quoted a recent report from the UN Development Agency, which challenges that long-held view that actually human rights performance comes at a price to the competitiveness of business. So if you invest in human rights, you're not going to do very well competitively. The report looked at 235 global companies and compared their human rights performance with their business performance and their business competitiveness. And they found not only did it not impact financial performance. In fact, in some areas, like return on assets, there was a positive link. So really important. This is the sort of evidence we think that we need to give to government. More resilient supply chains and more productive workforces will meet the costs over time, that they will be worth a price worth paying. We often look at the cost of due diligence, but we rarely set out the benefits. And this report is really important, I think, because it says, actually, you're going to be more successful commercially. So again, this is the point we make. It matters to people, of course it does. But actually, sometimes with business, you just have to say it matters to your business as well. And that's what it's all about. So prevention, whether it's early intervention with children at risk or whether it's human rights due diligence, is an investment. It's an investment which protects people and prevents harm. But the evidence, I would argue, also suggests it makes good business sense, whether that's for companies or whether that's for public authorities. Nearly 300 years ago, Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers of the United States, wrote, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." That was 300 years ago. He was actually talking about preventing fires in his hometown of city of Philadelphia. But I think it's incumbent on all of us to think about what more do we need to do to prevent labour exploitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dame Sarah, for that. And there's so much to unpack there, not just from the expertise that you bring to it from working so closely with CCLA and the Rights Lab, but also actually with your hinterland as Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner too. So I'm hoping to sort of draw those together a bit. First of all, I just wonder why you think prevention of labour exploitation has been a sort of poor relation compared to enforcement and the responses that traditionally that we've witnessed under the Modern Slavery Act, the Section 54 notwithstanding.
It's actually no different than in most areas that the state is engaged in. So if you think about health, the amount of money that the health service spends on prevention compared with crisis intervention is very small. It's exactly the same in policing, my background there. Very little in percentage terms is spent on direct prevention. And if you look over the years, whether it's public health models or even, Home Office policy on crime prevention, for 20 years, we've been saying we need to do more prevention. But we don't, because it's the point I made at the beginning. I think responding to the harm takes all our energy and focus all the time. We somehow need to get ahead of the curve. But I don't think that labour exploitation is any different from health, from crime, or other things that I would point to.
Although I suppose one might argue that, especially given the current debate around human rights, in inverted commas, especially given the debates around a government committed to growth and looking to reduce regulatory burden, which is one of the express things that the FWA is looking at, that there is a slightly different backdrop, isn't there? I mean, you've been very clear with what you just said there, that there is legislation is now needed to mandate human rights due diligence. How soon do you think we can expect that from your engagement with the government?
I work with colleagues who are very good at manifesting, so they keep saying, it's going to happen, it's going to be in the King's speech, which is in, 3 or 4 weeks' time. I'm not so sure.
Why not?
Well, we're all in the business of kind of exchanging political gossip on this at the moment. But we pick up, don't we? We know that the Home Office are going to have an immigration bill. And we think that probably in that immigration bill will be something around whether it's the NRM, support for victims, might link into entitlements under ECAT, under the European Convention Against Trafficking. And there is a debate, and I think some of us here have heard the minister say that, it might be possible to put some transparency in supply chain provisions in that bill, although we were chatting earlier whether that would be allowed or not, whether it's kind of making the bill too broad. But I think if the Home Office were doing it, it would be more about the sorts of things that have been discussed for a long time in transparency in supply chains and accepted by governments years ago, which was this should be extended to the public sector, that there should be clearer penalties, that there should be the 6 sections should be mandated. So there was a kind of tidying up, tightening up, toughening up the existing legislation. So that's what we hear. There's also been activity led by the Department of Business and Trade, but also by the Foreign Office. Let me talk about business and trade first. We know that they have been doing a review of responsible business conduct. We don't know whether that will be published. We don't know whether that review has kind of sort of developed into something which is sufficiently cooked, sufficiently kind of developed to be in a King's Speech. In my sense, it looks unlikely. I think for them to have done that. But there used to be a thing called the National Contact Point, which was under the OECD guidelines, which is all about if you're really concerned about something, you could take it to the state. It's a form of remedy. And they now call that, it's all part of the Office for Responsible Business Conduct. So there has been stuff happening in business and trade. Whether that will be legislation, the King's Speech, in 3 weeks' time, I doubt. But some colleagues keep manifesting it and saying it will be, but I'm not sure.
Well, let's see whether the optimists will win the day. But I mean, it just seems remarkable given that, you know, Baroness Lola Young's bill in 2023, we've had recommendations from the Joint Committee on Human Rights, Jane Lasonda, her voice, you know, resonating around this hall saying, just let's get this, let's mandate this, let's get this done. You'd think on the surface of it, not least because of the transparency in supply chains, you know, mandatory guidelines, that things were moving in the right direction, but it never, ever seems to quite cross the line, does it? What would it take?
Well, interesting. Okay, so it has been talked about, it has been progressing. There's also a lot of countervailing pressures as well. You've got pressure from the US around all things to do with human rights and environment. You've got the view that actually this is a burden on business and that we must cut the regulation. So yes, there has been progress. And then you've got the whole kind of tale of what's been happening in the EU, where they have gone down the line of corporate sustainability due diligence, but only applying to a very small number of companies. I got some data yesterday which suggested at group level it's only about 1,500 companies because it's such a high bar. So it's a kind of complex, kind of swirling picture. What would it take? Do you know what it took to set up the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority? It was a crisis. But I want to be careful. I'm not wishing a crisis. No. Because one of the difficulties I think we have is most of us who work in this field are in favour of due diligence. But actually, most people outside this room don't know what we're talking about. And even I find it quite tricky when I'm talking to business journalists and they do not know what I'm talking about when I talk about human rights due diligence. So I do think we tend to have a conversation amongst ourselves, and I think the general public and therefore members of Parliament, apart from some enthusiasts, don't really get it. And I think that, so I'm not wishing a crisis, but I just don't think it's something that people are talking about.
Okay, so there's a clear communication question around it, clearly out of that, and developing a narrative around that doesn't sort of, I suppose, frighten the horses, frankly, given how carefully the sector and politicians have to frame issues around human rights for all the very obvious reasons. Is what can happen in the absence of legislation coming forward? Because even if there were legislation, it's not necessarily permanent, is it? I mean, we've seen things being repealed from the previous government, especially around the Asylum and Borders Bill, not perhaps in the way that things haven't changed in the way that many people in this room might be happy with. But I'm just going to reflect on the Prosperity Institute document that Murray kindly flagged to us both this morning. Prosperity Institute partly informing some of the policies of reform. If we have a reform government, they were commenting that Alarm Clock Britain should be able to trust that its pension savings are being invested in a way that will maximise its retirement income. This paper that Prosperity Institute has done lays bare just how much worse off ESG makes British pension savers. Asset managers should beware of a future government committed to stopping this nonsense.
Okay. I just laughed at my colleague Martin, who will talk about this afternoon. We shared this paper yesterday in the office. Look, Legatum or Prosperity, the right has been attacking this for a long time. That report actually suggests we should take the role of the US, and investors in the US are really under pressure about what they can do. So it's not new. Two or three things to kind of say, because that's one particular view, and it's what I call the countervailing pressures.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I've just said in my kind of comments, what was it, 34 investors, 1.6 trillion assets under management have just signed a letter in favour of mandating human rights due diligence. So what Prosperity say is not the only view, it's just the other side of the argument. And secondly, for us at CCLA, because we're now part of a larger company called Jupiter, but let me just talk about CCLA. Very much investing on behalf of churches and charities. What our clients want is really important. And our clients, of course, want us to make money for them to do the great stuff they do. But they also want to make sure that we are investing ethically. So whether that's about avoiding some stocks, maybe that's tobacco, the Catholic Church has a view about what stocks they want to take, to invest in. We're careful about some things. But not only do we exclude certain stocks, we also say, of the companies in which we invest, what can we do as investors to encourage those companies to be better, whether it's in terms of the environment, in terms of health. One of my colleagues does a lot of work with companies that make food. How can the food have less sugar in, make us, less fat or whatever, all these things that matter, make our children healthier. But also, how can work be better? Which includes, actually, what can we do to create a work environment where slavery, exploitation and trafficking is so much less likely. So, yes, there are those views, but they're not the only views.
Okay. Core to what we've been talking about since we all arrived in this room this morning is how any of these decision-making processes can be impacted to the maximum effect by the engagement of those with lived experience. Where can you see the greatest impact of lived experience and survivors' voices in this field? Is it in engaging with businesses? Is it engaging with CCLA, for example? Where could these voices of expertise and experience be leveraged to maximum effect, and how should that be done, do you think?
So I think there is an opportunity, given the transparency guidelines say that the best companies should be, well, not best actually, companies should be engaging with those with lived experience. I don't think very many do that, and that would include survivors. I would also say it includes people who are representing rights holders. That could be trade unions, it could be affected populations. It's kind of a broad group, but it definitely includes those with lived experience. That is being encouraged. So how can that happen? Are companies reaching out to the panels that exist? I don't know. If they're not, what can we do to facilitate that, to bring people together? But I think Iffy makes some really good points about, we've got to think about survivors. She was talking about career paths and leadership. You can't just bring somebody in a very of course you can't, in a thoughtless way. We need to think about how do we equip people and prepare people to do that.
I mean, there's an opportunity here, presumably, for the sector, for so many people in this room. If legislation isn't quickly coming down the track, which it perhaps isn't, what can the sector move on and get going on that would make a material difference?
So there is the guidance. By the way, the government's trade strategy, which sets out a very strong argument for responsible business, the government says quite clearly, we expect business to do human rights due diligence. They just make it as an expectation rather than a legislative requirement. So that's what they think should be happening. So I think, take the government at its word and say, okay, businesses, we're here to help. How can we do this responsibly? It does. Both our work on the annual benchmark and the work on the national baseline assessment, I would say remedy is the weakest area, without a shadow of a doubt. Both remedy provided by the state and remedy from businesses. And I think from memory, the point you're making about civil measures, I think is in the model legislation that Andrew Wallace has been developing with Eleanor. And I think it was also in Lola Young's bill as well. There's a lot of people nodding, so it means my recollection is correct. Yeah. And I think that is right. There's a part of me, and people tell me off for saying this, but I think that's essential, that survivors and those impacted should be able to get access to remedy, because I'm realistic about the limitations of enforcement. I probably shouldn't say that, but coming from an enforcement background, I'm very realistic about it. Therefore, I think that actually civil remedy is really vital, and that's why it's in both those model bills. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I suppose that is so intriguing as a possibility when we're talking about prevention, and raises something that perhaps there may be. I'm sure I may be the first person to really consider that in that field of prevention. But it actually, I suppose, speaks a lot to your previous role as Anti-Slavery Commissioner, as well as the work that you're doing now. But prevention isn't just at the source of criminal activity. It can happen at these other stages, and we have to be alert to all of them. How does that sit in the business context?
I was going to answer it in the people context.
In the people context first.
If you, great colleague Liz Such wrote some good work on this for the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Centre, and she talked about the primary prevention, then the early intervention, then the support. But she added a fourth box, which was the prevention of re-trafficking. And I think that's really important. And that's why, when I was doing the anti-slavery work, I was very supportive of work that the Sophie Hayes Foundation does, for example, on employability programs. I think the more we can do to build people's skills up. I remember going very early days to a safe house, and a man saying to me, I've just got my positive NRM decision and I'm going to start training as a chef next week. And I thought, but you've been here for 2 years. Why couldn't you have trained as a chef for the last 2 years? So giving people the opportunities when you're going through the NRM process to get skills, to increase employability, is to me to be absolutely key, and it prevents future harm.
Thank you. I'm just going to just take 2 rapido questions, please. Just 1 sentence questions of a quick plea, and then we'll wrap up. There's 2 hands. Sorry, I'm so torn between hands. Okay, I'll be fair. There's 1 on this side of the room and 1 on this side of the room. Gentleman at the back, just 1 sentence question for me, please, and then the lady here who was waving at me. Sorry. It's always difficult when it's over the shoulder. Okay, really interesting. So collective bargaining, wherever we come in 10, 15 years, and sharing of intelligence. See how quickly you can rattle through those.
I think the important thing about mandating due diligence is you don't just end up with corporate responses, which are about cascading policies, whistleblowing, audits, that you've got to think about how it's bottom up as well. And that includes, I think, freedom of association, all those sorts of things. That's a very tricky question. I don't know how offenders identify lapse.
I was thinking with things like Operation Fort and similar large cases, what insights have those results given us?
Well, just the sheer scale of some of these networks, I think, is one of the most extraordinary things that we've realised through that, presumably.
I mean, I think, you know, let's think about the McDonald's case. The fact that they're franchises, the fact that, you know, the business models might be quite attractive, certainly where you've got lots of temporary labour, those sorts of things are attractive, which is what the Fort thing was. The extent to which OCGs kind of are opportunists or sit there and work this out, I don't know. That would be a very interesting thing. It's the sort of thing that Alicia could do, couldn't she? A bit of research on going to interview some of these people and find out how do you identify which workplaces to put people in.
And business
and
intelligence, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think that this is really important. When I was in, I still am in favour of a modern slavery intelligence network, I was coming to it with a law enforcement background, where weirdly you can share much more information. There are legal and commercial barriers to businesses sometimes sharing information, which you know about. But my strongest argument to you, and I think I've said this before, Claire, is that what you need to do to encourage your businesses to share is to tell your success stories. So in this instance, we shared this information and we protected these people and this harm was reduced. I think that's really important.
And those success stories are a really lovely note to finish on, because they are there. They just need to have sunlight shone on them and their findings be shared in the sort of communities that you work in now, in business and in the research that you're doing.
No, that's
fantastic.
right. Yeah.
Dame Sarah, always great to speak to you. You always bring so many areas of expertise to the table. It's just extraordinary. It's really lovely to chat to you again. Thank you very much indeed.
Very kind.